You know, I mentioned vacation, and people have said, oh, it's really too bad. You can't go on vacation. You know what? Vacation really is in the heart and the mind. It is. Oh, I see Elida improving every day. And the fact that I can be a servant, oh, that's vacation. That's good. That is good. So, thanks for your prayers. Really appreciate it. Been very interesting week. And it will continue to be. It's good. It's good. Well, Nehemiah chapter 5 is our passage this morning. Nehemiah chapter 5. And what we have seen in this book so far is that Nehemiah, the cupbearer of the king, really felt called by God to do a good work. And that's been our theme, the good work. And that carries through into today, that perhaps God has a special good work for us to do. Whether it's the person over the back fence or the person who gardens next to us, like I mentioned earlier, or maybe a good work to extend ourselves beyond Grand Rapids, West Michigan, into a mission community of sending love, money, Bibles, whatever. But what kind of good work can I do? What kind of good work is God calling me to do? And so we pray about it. And that's what we saw in that first week, that Nehemiah prayed, and God led him as cupbearer of the king to go to King Artaxerxes and say, I need to go back to my home community where my forefathers lived, and I need to rebuild the walls of that broken down city. The king said yes. Nehemiah went. He explored the situation. He rallied the troops. They built the walls. They had opposition. We talked about that, how they had opposition. And yet the walls finally were completed. But during that period of time, Nehemiah was approached by both men and women, husbands and wives, who said, we've got a serious problem here. And the serious problem was in part the fact that, well, it was tough times. It was tough times. It was kind of like the 1930s Depression. There was a lot of poverty. And the fact that they had to come off their farms and rebuild the walls didn't help any. But one of the problems also was the fact that those who did have money and resources were taking advantage of those who didn't, or those who had meager supply. And that's where that theme of injustice and callousness enters the picture. So let's read some of that 5th chapter. Picked out selected verses. Let's go to chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. And here they come to Nehemiah. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry, against, now notice, not some mean, cruel emperor or some horrible country that was invading them. We saw that earlier with the opposition. But now against their fellow men and women, their fellow Jews, their fellow Judeans. And so they raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, we and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain. Well, the problem was, as I said, fellow Jews were taking advantage of them. And in verse 3, others were saying, we are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine. They had to mortgage their homes, mortgage their fields. But they also had to pay tax to the Persian king, the king that let Nehemiah go back home. And so in verse 4, we read, still others were saying, we have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our field and on our vineyards. But what was most horrible is the fact that when they did have to put up collateral, or if they did have to pay interest in order to get grain and get help, they had nothing to give other than themselves. So in verse 5, we read, although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and our daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. So the wealthy said, yeah, we'll give you grain, but you got to put up collateral or you've got to pay interest. Well, I don't have anything to pay you. Well, then you have to give us your children. And those children then were often sold into slavery, sometimes to other Jews and sometimes to neighboring pagan nations. Now just think of it. If you had to stay alive, you give your children as collateral and as interest in order to get grain to live, with the hope of someday maybe you can buy them back. And you had to give your children not to some horrible government, but to your fellow Jews who had the money to care about you, but demanded that you pay with your children or with your family. Verses 6 and 7. Verses 6 and 7, Nehemiah gets mad. When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry, and I pondered them in my mind, and then accused the nobles and the officials, and I told them, you are charging your own people interest. So I called together a large meeting to deal with them. Called together, he confronts them. Verse 9, 10, and 11. I continued, what you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? They'll know we are Christians by our love. In other words, when the pagans see what you are doing to your own people, it makes a mockery of what we stand for. I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money, said Nehemiah. We're lending them grain, but let us stop charging interest. Give back to them immediately. Give back to them their fields, their vineyards, their olive groves, their houses, and the interest that you are charging them, 1%. He goes on to talk about what the interest was. He says, give it back. If they put up a piece of land as collateral, or if they gave you some of their crop or their children, give it back to them. Not right. Absolutely not right. Verse 12, we will give it back, they said, and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. And then I summoned the priests and made the nobles and the officials take an oath to do so. We'll give it back, they said. And then Nehemiah does an interesting thing in verse 13. In verse 13, he shakes out his robe. Shakes out his robe. I shook out the folds of my robe, and I said, in this way may God shake out of their house and possessions anyone who does not keep this promise. So may such a person be shaken out and emptied. Nehemiah says, as he shakes out his robe, he says, if you are mean and cruel and callous and indifferent and proud and power hungry in your relationship and your treatment of your fellow people, may God shake you out. Pretty stern. And then he says, not only should you be fair and have justice and treat people with respect and dignity and love, but you need to be good examples in your own lives. As I, Nehemiah, said, as I am, he says in verse 14 and following, he says, moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I was appointed to be the governor in the land of Judah until his 32nd year, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governors. But the earlier governors, those preceding me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition to the food and the wine. Their assistants also lorded it over the people, But out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. Instead, I devoted myself to the work on this wall. All my men were assembled there for the work. We did not acquire any land. Furthermore, 150 Jews and officials ate at my table, as well as those who came to us from the surrounding nations. Each day, 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, some poultry were prepared for me, and every 10 days an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. In spite of all this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor, because the demands were heavy on these people. Remember me, Lord, with favor. Remember me, Lord God, for all I have done for these people. He says, I had privileges as the governor. I was appointed governor by the king, and I had privileges. Choice food, the best wine, extra money. I could have collected taxes from the people myself. He said, I didn't do it. But instead, I provided some of my own possessions for them, and I worked alongside of them in rebuilding the wall. That's the kind of government officials that are important. Nehemiah says, I was right there with you, and I shared my wealth, I shared my food, and I shared my efforts. As I read the story, as I read these passages, came to realize that in this story, there are 3 groups that were responsible for the care of the people, particularly those that had meager land and meager supplies and really needed help. 3 groups. One was the government, and Nehemiah was the government. Secondly, also what we would call the church, that is the official religious body. Back at that time, it wasn't the church, it was the temple and the Levites and the priests and so forth. And so Nehemiah plays sort of a dual role. He is like a spiritual leader, but he is also the governor. And then the third group is the family. The families that lived along and next to each other and were supposed to be there to help each other. And so 3 groups. You have the official government, you have the religious community, what we would call the church, and then you have the family. And those 3 groups still exist today. And as I studied this and came away with the question, well, what is this passage saying to us? Other than obviously the fact that we should not have proud and callous hearts. What's it saying? Well, one of the things, remember that last part that I read about Nehemiah and the kind of governor that he was? That we need to have a government which is caring, respectful of people, a government that is concerned about justice. That's the kind of government that we need to have, whether it be West Michigan or the state of Michigan or the federal government. We need to have that kind of a government. We need to have a government system that is built into it respect for people and the opportunity for people not only to survive, but even to succeed. We need to have that kind of a government. Now, Calvinism, the Reformed tradition, has, especially in America, has generally supported capitalism. Capitalism with a compassionate side or a compassionate heart to it that says we want a capitalistic system of free enterprise and individual effort, but also built within is that arena, that area of care and concern for the legitimately poor and the disadvantaged. Well, it isn't so much a certain kind of government, because there are also Reformed Calvinistic communities like in Canada that are socialistic, and even American capitalism now has drifted more towards socialism. And there are other countries that are communistic. So it's not so much this morning that I'm saying we have to be capitalists and have capitalism, though I myself would prefer that style of government. But what we're saying is no matter what the form of government, there has to be that attitude of justice and compassion and respect. And what we have seen in the history of humanity, the history of the church, the history of America, we have seen that sometimes that has been true and often it hasn't been true. Karl Marx believed that communism was going to be the key to some kind of justice for all people. And maybe it could have been somewhat successful had it not, as a government system, fallen into the hands of people who were very, very power hungry. There were vicious people, the Stalins. There were vicious and power hungry people, the Khrushchevs, who demanded atheism and who themselves became rich while others became poor. And I remember talking to Christian groups that went to Russia in the 1970s and 80s, and they said the farming methods and the farming equipment is like what we in America had in the early 1900s. It's very primitive. And so one could certainly argue that communism as a system is not going to work, which I don't think it can. But what made it especially horrible was the fact that it had people, and here's the key, people who lacked a respect for individuals and who had a lack of respect for justice. And that's one of the beauties of America, the fact that we can go to the voting booth, the ballot box, as we sometimes call it, and we can vote out people who have usurped their power. They have taken advantage of their position, and they have taken advantage of people. So I believe one of the things that this story of Nehemiah is teaching us is that we need to demand that a government, just like in Nehemiah's day, that a government lives in such a way that they are examples of caring, they are examples of respect, they are examples of justice, and they do everything they can to construct a government and to construct a nation in which there is opportunity for individual freedom, individual initiative, respect for individuals, the opportunity to get ahead, to have freedom, as well as built into that system the opportunity for the legitimately poor and disadvantaged to have the help that they do deserve. It has not always been true in America. I hope it's true today. A lot of debate about the whole Trump era and now the Biden era and all of that. But it certainly has not always been true. There was a time when African American, black people were not permitted to vote. They were lynched in their front yards. And so even though Martin Luther King Jr. was very controversial, even among black pastors, even though he was controversial, the theme of the civil rights movement, I believe, was very legitimate. It was saying, look, we have to have a nation that respects people as people. There was an event at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama where there was a peaceful march, and troopers came in and beat the people viciously. They just beat them viciously. And the President of the United States then nationalized the state troopers and brought in military individuals and then permitted a march. Thousands of people showed up. And Martin Luther King gave a speech at that time, and in that speech, it's very interesting. He said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And what he meant was that injustice can exist only for a period of time until the people will rise up, or good leaders will rise up, and there will be change. And that's what happened in Nehemiah's day. Let's watch a clip of that speech. This was at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that march. And notice also how he uses that great hymn, which has a lot of just huge amount of biblical references in it, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. But let's watch.
How long? Not long. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.
Yes, sir.
How long? Not long.
Not long.
Because mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Yes, sir.
He's trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
He's loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword.
Yes, sir.
His truth is marching on.
Yes, sir.
He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Oh, be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be jubilant, my feet. Our God is marching on. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
Quite a moment in history. And even though he was a controversial figure, the message is correct. We need to have a government and a nation, as in Nehemiah's day, that is focused on justice and respect for people. But now, also, remember I said there were three groups. There's also the church and the family. There has to be that within the family. I believe a family has to make sure that they've got an extra little pot off to the side just in case one of the members of their family needs some special help. I know it was a number of years ago, a relative of ours was struggling a bit, and we came to them. We said, look, here's some money. And no interest, no conditions, and you pay it back if you can, and they did. But there's that attitude of we're family, and we help each other. We help each other if you have to move, or if you have to maybe do some painting, or maybe if you need some advice on something. We're family. There has to be that attitude of family. Now, I know some families have division within them, and they have some rancor. But ideally, there has to be this attitude of family, and within the church as well, the church family. And here we have benevolence, and we've had the COVID fund, and we've been able to help a lot of people. And we have our team. See, justice doesn't just mean handing out money. Justice in a nation doesn't just mean everybody gets whatever they want. And in the family, it doesn't mean everybody gets whatever they want. But it does mean that there is a compassion, there is a heart, there is a respect. And so when the family member calls up the third time they're in jail and says, please come and bail me out, there may very well need to be at that point, no, I'm not going to. You know, you got yourself in the third time, and I think you need to sit for a while. That's justice. And that could also be love. So I'm not saying handouts. What I'm saying is respect for the individual within the family, within the church, and when it is appropriate, that the ability and the desire to care is there. It's there, like the baskets. Let's take a look at some of these women and the baskets. I've read to you before about how this is Pastor Isaac in Kenya. And they're making these, some of them are small. One we have up here is I think this is a medium to large. And they're beautifully done. I don't see how people can make that stuff. And something like this, I don't know, $40 or something like that. See, is there a price tag on it? No, Jane. It's made by Jane, and here's her picture. But we do it like putting in wells and toilets in Bangladesh. People heard that in Bangladesh, our church in Bangladesh, people have to go to the bathroom out in public. Squat over the hole in public. And we said, no, come on. We don't want our church to have to do that. And so we built bathrooms. And we saw the murky pond where they were getting their drinking water. It had green stuff on the top. We said, no, we're the church. Now, we can't do it all. We cannot do it all. We've sent Bibles to Pakistan, Muslim people who want Bibles. Now, we can't supply the entire nation of Pakistan with Bibles, but we can do a part. We can do a piece. If there is a heart, if there is a desire. And see, missions has to be more than, oh yeah, we've got this family over there in Nigeria, and they come once a year and talk about how they did this or how they did that, and we send them X amount of dollars. But mission has to be an involvement where we say we are family. And it could be like the one family here in this congregation. This past year, we were able, because of what was in our fund, to help that person actually make a down payment on a house. It only took some hundreds of dollars, but it's what that person didn't have, and we stepped in, and now they can have their own house. Wow. Now we've got a team, a committee that works on that. Again, justice. Justice doesn't just mean you hand it out. Justice does mean you examine it carefully. But there comes a point at which you say, as the church and as the family, we have to have the pot, we have to have the supply that's sitting there ready to go, and we have to have the desire to reach out and to care. That was so evident with Nehemiah. Those three groups, the government, the church, and the family. And Nehemiah called them together. Called us together this morning. Not that we've had an injustice, but we've been called together this morning to be reminded that the love of Jesus has to mean something. Not just, hey, I'm saved and going to heaven. That's important. But it also has to mean something in the here and now in terms of attitude and action.